Hello and welcome to AngularJS for the People, Training Video Part 1. My name is Dr. Daniel Niclas, and my goal in this video is to introduce you to an exciting JavaScript MVC framework called AngularJS. Angular can be complicated, so my plan is to move through each topic in a thoughtful, thorough, and step-by-step manner. It is just too great and powerful of a technology to not give it the time and attention it deserves. I will do my best to explain the key fundamental topics and help enable you to start building your own browser-side single-page application with AngularJS. By the end of this video, you will have completed a simple Angular application with exhaustive explanation of all parts and pieces. In future tutorials, after we have completed all of the videos comprising AngularJS Fundamentals, my plan is to systematically walk you through the full JavaScript stack, including Node.js, Express.js, and MongoDB, so you can build your own full-stack web application. If you would like to contact me, please visit danielniclas.com. Okay, let's go. First, the agenda, starting with what is AngularJS? Angular is an example of an MVC framework, and we will look at each of these constructs, the model, the view, and the controller. Then we will explore the amazing scope object. From there, we will learn what a directive is and the data synchronization process known as data binding. Next, we will learn how to format our data with filters, and to conclude, we will review the critical Angular modules and use them to build a complete Angular MVC application with both HTML and JavaScript. Angular is a full-featured single-page application framework, and as such offers much more than a JavaScript library such as jQuery. In fact, Angular includes its own implementation of a subset of jQuery called JQLite. Angular is an MVC framework, which stands for Model View Controller. The core idea behind MVC is that there is a clear separation in the code between managing the data, or the model, the application logic, or the controller, and presenting the data to the user, the view. MVC frameworks are excellent for building single-page applications. A common question that arises when introduced to Angular is how is it different from jQuery? I believe that the primary differences between the Angular MVC framework and a library such as jQuery is that Angular is declarative and jQuery is imperative. In other words, in jQuery, you apply JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, creating, removing, and modifying DOM elements. But in Angular, you declare what the DOM should look like right from the start. In Angular, you split the logic from the presentation. In jQuery, because you have to use DOM selectors, they are tied together. This will become more obvious to you as we progress through this video. Some additional information about Angular. It was developed by a Google employee named Mishko Hevery starting in 2009. It is open sourced by Google, and there is a very large development community standing behind it. The first version of Angular was released in 2012. As of November 19, 2015, we are at version 1.4.8. All Angular documentation can be found at angularjs.org. Before diving into the introduction to MVC, let's take a moment to briefly review what is a single-page application. SPA for short are browser-based applications that often use patterns such as MVC. They are bookmarkable and devoid of any full-page refresh. Once the application is loaded to the client, any future page navigations are retrieved using AJAX. HTML fragments or partial views are injected directly into the already loaded shell page. Using the Angular MVC framework, building a single-page application can be accomplished with virtually no DOM manipulation at all. How is this possible? With declarative programming. Let's jump in with an introduction to models, views, controllers, and then the very important scope object. What is an MVC framework? These MVC frameworks have been around for some time. Essentially, all MVCs are based on the concept of separation of responsibility, and they consist of three basic components: the model, or the data representing the state of the system, the view, which is a UI projection of the model data, and the controller, which coordinates between the model and the view, presenting the data to the user. One topic not addressed in this slide is the Angular scope object. I will introduce you to this object shortly, as it is an Angular specific topic. We will look at each MVC component individually, starting with the model. The model hosts all data, properties, and methods that are linked to the Angular application, and represents the state of the system that is projected to the view. There is a bidirectional relationship between the model and the view, as UI events can interact with the model. Since I have already introduced the view into this discussion of the model, I must also quickly mention that the model is encapsulated in a construct called the controller. The controller exposes the model data to the view. As you can see, these components are all tightly coupled. We have only been introduced to the model, which necessitated also mentioning the view and the controller. Next MVC construct, the controller. As mentioned in the previous slide about the model data and functionality are encapsulated in a construct called the controller. The controller hosts the model. The controller also exposes the data, or the properties, and the functionality, or methods, that are made available to the view. In short, the controller manages the model and the view. As mentioned previously, the relationship between the view and the model is bidirectional, and hence the user's actions on the view can drive the controller's functionality by calling on the exposed methods. It is also worth mentioning now that the controller can be set up to interact with a backend data store. This can be accomplished with something called a service, which will be discussed in a later video. And finally, the view. The state or model of the system or application is represented in the view. In other words, the view is a UI projection of the model data. Angular links the view HTML to the AngularJS framework with something called directives. Directives are constructs that extend the standard HTML vocabulary. A directive is written into the HTML as an attribute, which usually has an associated value. There is one directive in particular called ng-app that declares an HTML element as an Angular application. More on directives to come, but I wanted to introduce this one directive, ng-app, as it links the view to the controller and effectively initializes the Angular application. in a process also known as application bootstrapping. We know that the controller exposes the model data to the framework, and that the view HTML is linked to the Angular framework with directives. But we still have not discovered what is linking the controller and the view. Exactly what is responsible for shuttling the model data back and forth in this bidirectional manner. The link between the view and the controller is the scope object. Now we have the complete picture of MVC with scope included. The Angular framework creates the scope object. As a JavaScript object, the scope object will bind properties and methods. The scope object, serving as the link between the view and the controller, will shuttle exposed properties and methods of the model to the view. It will also allow actions on the view side by the user to trigger methods that are exposed by the scope object and to also modify exposed properties. Scope is the data for the view and can be referred to as the view model, linking the view with the model. This is the perfect time to introduce you to another important characteristic of Angular. Angular is data-driven. If you add more data to the model and hence alter the state, this data will automatically be available to the view with no data synchronization required. All of this is taken care of by Angular and its declarative nature. With jQuery, you may have to create DOM elements and then synchronize them with the view, hence its imperative nature. Data is the fuel of Angular. Now that we have an understanding of the MVC framework, I would like to elaborate on directives and introduce the topic of data binding in Angular. In order to write our first Angular application, including directives, it is necessary to reference the Angular library. As we know, Angular is a framework with a library written in JavaScript. AngularJS is distributed as a JavaScript file that can be added to a web page with a script tag, either by pointing to the downloaded library file or pointing to the CDN or Content Delivery Network for the library file. Directives are constructs that extend the standard HTML with new functionality, and for this reason, some people have referred to Angular as HTML6. Directives are custom HTML attributes that Angular understands. These Angular directives that are added to HTML elements as attributes usually have an associated value. Directives are declarative in nature and declare how the HTML is to behave and what the DOM is to look like. I like to think of directives as a portal on the HTML side, allowing model properties and functions that are bound to the scope object to enter the HTML world from the JavaScript world and vice versa. You will see that the controller can be considered such a portal, but on the JavaScript side, as it exposes the model data to the view. Angular has many built-in, ready-to-use directives, and you will learn in later lessons that you can also build your own custom directives. Building your own custom directive allows you to create custom HTML elements with any tag name you want. This is very cool and very powerful. Directives are a very powerful part of the Angular framework. With directives, you effectively are extending the HTML vocabulary and functionality. This slide introduces you to three important directives: ng-app, which we have touched on briefly already, ng-bind, and ng-model. All built-in Angular directives start with the prefix ng-. ng-app defines and initializes the Angular application in a process called application bootstrapping. ng-bind declares a one-way data binding by linking the HTML view with the application data, the linked scope. It is like an HTML portal to receive data from the context of the linked scope. And ng-model, a directive that declares two-way data binding by linking the value of HTML controls, like an input element, to the application data as scope.property. There will be much more to say about this directive to help you understand how two-way data binding by ng-model works. ng-model simulates an HTML portal to bidirectionally exchange data with the linked scope. Let's build our first Angular application. Some of you will notice right away that this small application is all HTML and there is no JavaScript here at all. That is correct. There is no JavaScript other than referencing the Angular library in script tags, initializing the application, creating a scope, data binding, and all DOM manipulation occurs behind the scenes by the Angular framework and with the help of directives that are embedded in the HTML. Angular is very powerful, and there is a lot going on in the background. You can see in this small application there is an ng-app directive, an ng-model directive, and an ng-bind directive. The ng-app directive defines the AngularJS application. ng-app declares that everything within this div element is recognized as an Angular application. Whenever Angular encounters the ng-app directive, it starts the initialization process referred to as application bootstrapping, and with this one directive we have an official Angular application. With ng-app, the Angular framework creates a scope object and links it to the application. This is a global scope called root scope. Every Angular application has a root scope. Root scope will be available to shuttle model data back and forth between the model and the view. In the coming slides, we will create custom controllers with unique scope objects. But in this most simple case, with no JavaScript, we will take advantage of the root scope object to shuttle data between model and view. The next directive we encounter is ng-model. As mentioned already, ng-model declares two-way data binding with HTML control elements. HTML controls include the HTML elements input, select, and text area. These HTML elements possess an input value that changes depending what the user enters into the text field in the UI. ng-model sets up a link between the scope property that is passed in as the ng-model attribute, the ng-model attribute value, which in this case is puppy, and the HTML input element value, which is whatever the user enters in the UI. If this property named puppy is not already declared on the root scope object, it will be with the help of the ng-model directive. whatever value the user types into the input element text field is assigned to root scope.puppy. This is an example of data binding as the input value is bound to the root scope. In the other direction, whatever value finds itself attached to root scope.puppy will automatically populate the input field in the UI. And hence, we have two-way data binding. This occurs entirely behind the scenes by Angular. All you do is declare the HTML input element to have two-way data binding with the ng-model directive, and Angular does the rest. Please note that ng-model and two-way data binding will only work with HTML input elements, as it is necessary to bind the input element value with the scope property, or root scope in this case. Let's quickly observe this application in action. There is an excellent Google Chrome plugin cleverly called ng-inspector. Launching this tool will show all scopes created for this Angular application. We can see that root scope has been created. And as soon as I enter a value into the input field, the puppy property is created on root scope, and the entered value is bound to root scope.puppy. Root scope.puppy is now bound to the value entered into the input field. Next, how do we project the value of root scope.puppy to the view in a one-way manner? This is accomplished with the ng-bind directive. Just add ng-bind as an attribute and pass the attribute value of the scope property that you want to see in the view. In this case, the scope property is puppy. Whatever value is carried by root scope.puppy will appear within this paragraph element like a portal from another world, which is the Angular application state. Again, we are using a directive to bind to scope property, puppy in this case, and the value assigned to the directive identifies the scope property to bind to. There is another way to accomplish this one-way data binding using interpolation symbols, these double curly braces. Whatever expression or scope property is included between the interpolation symbols will appear in the view, exactly the same as with ng-bind. Let's take a look at one-way data binding using ng-bind and interpolation symbols, both included in sibling H2 elements. I will add text to the input value, which is linked to root scope.puppy by ng-model. Then ng-bind and the interpolation symbols project the puppy property value to the view in sibling H2 elements. They both do the same thing in this example. Here we have another look at ng-bind and interpolation symbols. Expressions can be included in the interpolation symbols. These expressions are evaluated, and the result is displayed to the view. On top, we have the expression 5 plus 5 evaluated inside the interpolation symbols, which will render the value 10 to the view. Below reiterates the binding of the input element value with the root scope property puppy as declared by ng-model. Rendering to the view is achieved with ng-bind or the interpolation symbols. Both ng-bind and interpolation symbols achieve one-way data binding and serve as a portal between the AngularJS scope and the HTML view. We are now experiencing more and more exciting and powerful features of Angular. Another powerful and frequently used directive is ng-repeat. Can you guess what ng-repeat might do if you declared it inside an HTML tag? You guessed it, it repeats the element over and over for every item in a referenced array or object. In our example, it will duplicate the h2 element based on the number of items in this array assigned to the puppies variable. The puppies array is bound to root scope with the ng-init directive. Since there is no JavaScript yet in these Angular applications, with the exception of the Angular reference and our small array, the puppy array can be added to the current scope or root scope with the ng-init directive. Using ng-init in this way is considered bad practice. So as soon as we create our own controller with JavaScript, we will never use ng-init again. We can now see the puppy array as a property of root scope by checking with our scope tool ng-inspector. Let's visit the browser and run our application. With ng-inspector, you can see the puppies array bound to root scope thanks to the ng-init directive. And we can also see 4 h2 elements rendered in the view, one for each item in the array. I will get to the rest of this stuff in just a moment. The attribute ng-repeat is assigned a value pup in puppies. This declares pup as a scope property that will represent the current iterated array item in the puppies array. Let's take a look at ng-inspector again to see how the array and its individual items are attached to the scope. While this may be a little bit advanced for us now, you can see that the root scope has the array puppies attached. And each iteration of ng-repeat, 1, 2, 3, 4, has created its own scope for each repeated HTML element, and there is a pup property bound to each of these scopes. And the value of the pup property for each of these scopes is the pup name from the array. The important point is that all elements of the array are attached to scope now and available for view in the view using ng-bind or interpolation. This pup property can be named anything you want, as you are merely defining a variable to represent each item in the array. Earlier, when talking about scope, I emphasized that Angular is data-driven. We now have another excellent example how merely adding data will drive the Angular application. Let's add another name to the puppies array, and boom, it is iterated as a new HTML element. Let's take a look in the browser. I'll add another name to the array. Save it and visit the browser. For every additional name added to the array, another h2 element is created. We have now seen a couple examples of how Angular synchronizes the model with the view. Can you remind me what is tying the model to the view? Yes, the scope. Next topic is Angular filters. Sometimes you want or need to format the value of an expression rendered in the view. You may want the date or time to appear in a certain format, or the way that you display a currency value. Angular has many predefined or built-in filters for dates, numbers, and strings, like all lowercase or all uppercase. Filters are an excellent way to transform the source model into different formats without changing the model data itself. Here we have an example how a filter is used in the view. Inside the interpolation is the expression, followed by a pipe symbol, which is then followed by the filter name, which is followed by an optional input parameter separated by a colon. Below are two examples of built-in filters. One, to change the name expression to all lowercase. This filter is called lowercase. This one does not use the optional input parameter. And the other filter example is to adjust the format of the date expression. And this filter is called date. This one does use the optional input parameter for day, month, year, and the day of the week. Just like with the directive construct, you can also build your own filters. We will get to this in more advanced discussions. There is a built-in filter that works great with the ng-repeat directive. This filter is called filter. This filter is one of the more confusing built-in Angular filters. Nevertheless, here is my explanation to help reveal the power of this filter. The filter can be used to filter items out of an array based on a matching string. For example, all names in the array that contain the letters MO. This matching string can be a value that is entered by the user into an input field and nicely bound to the scope with ng-model. Remember that ng-repeat iterates through arrays and replicates the HTML element for each item in the array, which in this case are 4 objects. For each pup object in the puppies array, an h2 element will be created and rendered to the view. The input parameter for our filter is the value of the name text property. Since the name text property is bound to the input element by ng-model, it is also available on root scope to also serve as the input parameter for our filter. The filter will pull out only those objects containing names that match the string entered into the input field. The order by filter will then filter the selected elements in alphabetical order based on the name value stored in each array object. Let's quickly observe this filter application in action. First, we can see all the pups in the array iterated in alphabetical order. When I add the letter M to the input field, those names of the array that contain the letter M will be filtered out and iterated to the view when I add in alphabetical order. When I add the letter O for the string MO, only those names containing the string MO will be iterated to the view. By the way, we still have not written any JavaScript in our small applications. all of this great functionality so far has been accomplished by declaring directives in the HTML. And now, for the awesome grand finale of this course, we are going to build an Angular MVC application with JavaScript, hopefully in about 5 minutes. So far, with the exception of initializing arrays in the HTML and referencing the Angular library, we have written no JavaScript at all. The time has arrived for JavaScript. Now we will build our own MVC with both HTML and JavaScript. Angular has a global object called Angular. This global object hosts a variety of methods of critical importance. One of these critical methods, and maybe the most critical, is called module. All Angular applications live inside modules. A module is nothing more than a container or construct to hold Angular-specific implementations. We are now going to implement an Angular application. Step 1. Declare the Angular module by calling the module method on the global Angular object. The module method takes 2 parameters. Parameter 1 is the name you would like to give to your Angular application module. In this case, my app. Parameter 2 is an array used for a service called dependency injection, which we will not use at this time, so we will leave the array empty. We now have an Angular application module named my app, and this app module is returned and stored in this app variable. Such a sweet package. This application module can now be linked with the view using the ng-app directive and adding the application module name, my app, as the attribute value. The Angular.module function creates a module and returns a module object. Now that we have an application module with a name, we need a controller to host our model data and expose some of it so that we may bind it to the view. This is step number 2, to register a controller with the Angular application module. The controller method is one of the methods available in our Angular module object. The controller method accepts 2 parameters. Parameter 1 is the name you want to give to your controller. I have chosen myCTRL for my controller. Parameter 2 is the actual controller implementation and the future home of our model properties and methods and the application logic. The controller is now registered with the application module. In summary, the Angular.module function creates a module and returns a module object. This module object has a function called controller that allows us to register a controller, which we have now done. What time is it? It's time to build our model. Step 3. We have an Angular application module with a registered controller, and now we can add the model to the controller. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the parameter passed to the controller implementation function. Scope. We need to inject the scope object into the implementation function so that it is available for us to build our model. Remember, scope is our data carrying object that travels between the view and the controller. Scope has also been referred to as the link or view model between the controller and the view. Passing scope to this controller implementation is an example of dependency injection that is built into AngularJS. To create a model, we add properties to the scope object, scope.firstName and scope.lastName, and even add a method called fullName, which returns scope.firstName plus scope.lastName. This controller is now set up to expose data to the view with the Scope Data Transport System. The scope will be bound to the view as soon as we declare this controller in the view. As you can see, there is a little plumbing going on here. We linked our app with the name MyApp to the view by declaring a div as an Angular application with the MyApp attribute value. Now we are going to link our controller to the same div with a new kind of declaration called ng-controller. Notice here in the view we make two important declarations. One, we declare this div as an Angular application using ng-app directive and tell it to look for the Angular application named MyApp. Two, using the ng-controller directive, we declare the same div to link with the controller named myCTRL. With the myCTRL controller comes the model exposed by it. This model is referenced by the scope object, which is exclusive to the myCTRL controller. Taking a closer look at the view, in the first input element, ng-model is binding the input element value with the first name property. Remember that the first name is a property of the scope object. In the second input element, ng-model is binding the input element value with the last name property. And remember that last name is also a property of the scope object. And finally, the full name method is called as an expression in this interpolation statement. Please note that the scope object defined in the myCTRL controller is not the root scope. The root scope is still present in this application, but our controller named myCTRL creates a new scope object based on the one passed to the implementation function. ng-controller is an example of a directive that creates a scope object. This myCTRL scope object is the one that carries the first name and last name properties as well as the full name method. Two-way data binding now becomes very evident. Let's observe this application in action. I will also launch ng-inspector so that we may view the associated scopes. We can see the root scope as well as the myCTRL scope. Since the scope object created by the myCTRL controller has the properties first name and last name declared with the assigned values John and Doe, these values will automatically appear in the HTML input fields since the input field values are bound to the myCTRL scope by the ng-model directive with two-way data binding. When I type into these input fields, the values of the respective scope properties will change with it because they are bound. And the same applies to the last name, also bound. This is two-way data binding in action with no DOM manipulation required. In review, declaring ng-model binds the HTML input values with the scope properties identified by ng-model. In other words, ng-model sets up a link between the scope properties first name and last name and the HTML input element values for first name and last name. As we change the input value, the scope property changes with it, and the other way around. If you change the scope property in the model, the input values will change. This is the beauty of declarative programming, as you don't have to worry about DOM manipulation or synchronizing the model with the view. This also supports the data-driven model, as any data added to the model will automatically be rendered to the view by Angular. We have now taken the first steps to build a full-scale, single-page application with Angular. This is just the beginning, yet it is already infinitely awesome. We have used the global Angular object to create and return an application module. With this module, we have created and registered a controller. Inside the controller, we defined a model and linked it to the HTML with directives. This slide identifies the other great functionality available from the Angular module object. So far, we only used the controller method. I mentioned to you that we can create custom filters and directives. Here you can see there is a module.filter method and a module.directive method that will allow us to create these custom directives and filters. There are also methods to allow us to create and return what are called services and factories. Services and factories are very similar, and hence they are all blue and in the same column. Services are reusable pieces of code that can be shared across controllers, directives, filters, and other services. They are often used to communicate with server-side APIs to gather data. The route module, you will discover, is also very important for single-page applications for routing HTML partial views to the right place in your view. Next time we meet, we will dive into all of the above, and then together we will march down the stack into Node, Express, Mongoose, and Mongo. Till then, study, 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 write code, exercise, and eat more vegetables. Thank you.